Great. Thank you, Koon. And thanks to all of you for joining this learning session on this beautiful Saturday afternoon. My name is Adam Cree. I'm the Associate Director of Finance and Admin with the CBOQ, and you'll hear more from me in a little bit through our video. But before we get to our video, I'd like us to open with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. Lord, we thank you for this opportunity to gather with our family of churches at Assembly. And we thank you for bringing us to today's learning session. And Lord, we lift up this learning session, the other learning sessions, and all of Assembly to you. We pray for your blessing upon us and upon our gathering. May we receive what you're revealing to us today and throughout this conference. In the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen. Amen. Okay, so just a friendly reminder, if you have any questions you want to address in the Q&A period, please write them in the chat to Koon. She will compile them and we'll get through as many as possible at the end of today's session. So at this time, I will hand things over to our good friend Ian to start playing the video. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining today's learning session about church finance and HR FAQs. My name is Adam Cree, and I'll be speaking about 5 frequently asked questions about church finance matters. Well, before we go into those questions, I'd like to give a little bit of background information about myself. I joined the CBOQ last August as the Associate Director of Finance and Administration. So I'm coming up on my 1-year anniversary of CBOQ. Prior to working with CBOQ, I worked with the Salvation Army in their finance department for 7 years. I'm a chartered professional accountant, and I've been involved with my church as a treasurer for almost 6 years. I attend Bethany Baptist Church in Toronto. So I'm fairly familiar with the role and responsibilities that many of you as church treasurers have. So that's a little bit of background information about myself. Thanks again for joining this learning session, and I'm looking forward to discussing a few frequently asked questions with you today. So we have a list of 5 questions that we'll be talking about today. The first one, what insurance provider does CBOQ recommend for my church? Number 2, what CBOQ financial support is available to member churches? Number 3, what government financial support is available to churches? Number 4, what accounting system does CBOQ or other churches use? And lastly, number 5, when is the deadline to file my church's T3010 return? So we'll jump right into question number 1. What insurance provider does CBOQ recommend for my church? So unfortunately, there is no one-size-fits-all answer to this question. The answer will vary from church to church based off of your needs. But what we can provide are the names of a few insurance providers that our member churches use. So some insurance providers are Deeks Insurance, Robertson Hall, and Ecclesiastical Insurance. So from my own experience with my local church, we have our insurance with Robertson Hall, as does CBOQ. Something I want to highlight about Robertson Hall is they offer a discount to your church if you have a membership with the 4 Cs, which is the Canadian Centre for Christian Charities. So what Robertson Hall says is they have premium discounts available for 4C members, often equal to or greater than the cost of annual membership. So typically the annual membership for a church is around $300 to the 4 Cs. And with that membership, you get a lot of good resources from them. So if your church is currently using Robertson Hall for insurance, or if you're just shopping around for insurance quotes, I encourage you to explore this potential discount that comes by having a membership with the 4 Cs. Now I have a question for you. Are you happy with your church's insurance provider? And would you recommend it to other churches? If the answer to these questions is yes, I invite you, please write a message in the Zoom chat. At CBOQ, we operate as a family of churches. So It's good that we share this information with each other. So I'll give you a moment. If you're happy with your insurance provider, please just leave a message in the Zoom chat. Thank you. On to question number 2. What CBOQ financial support is available to member churches? This is one of the longer answers that I have for you. There are 3 main areas of financial support offered by CBOQ. So today we'll talk about grants, the basic group benefit subsidy, and also mortgages and loans available through CBOQ. So first we'll talk about grants. CBOQ currently budgets about $425,000 in grants to our member churches annually. So there is a sizable amount of grant funding available, but you do have to apply for it. There are 3 main categories of grants that you can apply for. Those categories are planting grants, revitalization grants, and ministry grants. There's a wealth of information available about this online on the CBOQ website. The web link is here in the slide deck. What I want to mention is that grant applications are reviewed twice annually. So the next deadline to submit a grant application is coming up in October 15. We've also been offering smaller grants, what we call micro grants. These grants are each up to about $1,000, and they're available for churches to enhance their communications technology. So perhaps paying for a Zoom subscription, if that's how your church is gathering right now, or upgrading microphones, things like that. These micro grants are also available for involvement in esports, which is becoming more popular with youth, especially, and also for missional generosity. What I love about these micro grants is it allows us to provide support to a higher volume of churches. So just last December, we approved 47 micro grants, and last month in May, we approved 25 more micro grants. So if your church feels like a micro grant could be good for your church or one of the other grants we talked about, I encourage you, check out our website. The link is here on the slide. Details are available online, and the application process is detailed there as well. Now, the second area of CBOQ financial support we'll talk about today is the basic group benefit subsidy. So this is a subsidy offered by CBOQ to help cover the cost of the basic group benefits for your church's pastor. This subsidy is typically limited to churches who have less than $100,000 in annual gross revenue. So the purpose of this subsidy is to help our smaller churches provide the basic group benefits to their pastors. Applications are due in January, and subsidies are approved for the calendar year. Details about this goes out in our out of operations newsletter, typically near the end of the calendar year. So stay tuned, it should be coming out in November or December. And if you do apply for the subsidy, if you qualify, the subsidy could be for 50%, 75%, or even 100% of the basic benefits cost. Now, the third area of CBOQ financial support we'll talk about today is about our mortgage and loans program. So this program is offered by CBOQ to allow your church to apply for a loan or a mortgage with us, as opposed to your financial institution. So the loan maximum is $15,000. The mortgage maximum is $750,000. And the mortgages are typically available to assist churches with major building projects. So if your church is looking into a building expansion or perhaps installing an elevator or a lift, a mortgage might be a good option for you to help fund the project. Our mortgages typically have a 25-year amortization period or repayment period. And similar to banks, we have 5-year mortgage terms, and we offer a fixed interest rate. And our interest rates are typically the same as the standard bank rate. We have a link on this slide to our mortgage application form. It's fairly lengthy. We request a lot of information about your church's financial position, what the funds will be used for, quotes from contractors if applicable. So if a mortgage or loan from CBOQ could be a blessing to your church, I encourage you to check out our website and read through the application form. Okay, so we're on to question number 3. What government financial support is available to churches? So there's 3 main areas that we'll talk about today. The first is the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy. Second, Canada Emergency Rent Subsidy. And lastly, we'll talk about a few sources of funding for capital projects. So number 1, the wage subsidy, or the CEWS. This subsidy is available to help cover the cost of payroll for employers who experience a revenue decrease during the pandemic. Applications are submitted for each claim period, and each claim period is 4 weeks long. The maximum subsidy that you can receive is 75% of your employee's salary, up to a maximum of $3,388 for each claim period. So essentially, every application only covers a 4-week period. We'll look through an example in a moment, but I do want to mention that from what I've heard from our member churches, many have been able to apply for and receive this wage subsidy, including my own local church and the CBOQ. It's been an amazing blessing for us. So I encourage you, if your church has declining revenue throughout the pandemic, this is something that would be good to research. So here's our example, just so we kind of get a feel for how the program works. Let's say your church has one employee who is paid $52,000 annually. That's $1,000 a week. Let's say your revenue for April 2019 and May 2019 was $10,000 for each month. Let's say your revenue for April and May 2021 was down to $6,000 for each month. So essentially, pre-pandemic revenue was $10,000 monthly. During the pandemic, it's down to $6,000. This means your revenue decreased by 40%, comparing pandemic numbers to pre-pandemic numbers. If we go through the subsidy calculations, it means your subsidy rate is 32%. So during this 4-week period, you paid your employee $4,000. Based on these numbers, you would be eligible to receive a subsidy of 32% of the salary that you paid. So you paid your employee $4,000, your subsidy or your refund from the federal government could be $1,280. And that's just for one period. There are 7 or 8 periods open right now. Now, full transparency, the application process and the calculations can be a little bit complicated. There are several elections you can make. You can do things one way or another way. So there is a fair bit of work involved for the treasurer, but the subsidy amount might be sizable for your church, especially if you're experiencing financial difficulty. So if this program sounds like it might be good for your church, I encourage you, here's the link on the slide deck for more information online. I encourage you to check out the website. If this sounds like it could be good for you, you can actually apply as far back as November 2020. So you could apply for November, December, January, February, March, and April. Many periods are open. I do want to mention that the deadline to apply for November 2020 is coming up soon. Deadline is June 17. So if you're not sure where to start, but you're interested in this program, or you have started the calculations, but you're maybe stuck along the way, if you need any help, I'm available here to help you. Please feel free to send me an email at acree@baptist.ca. Email is on the slide deck here. It's also in our staff directory. If you need any help, I'm here for you. The next area of government financial support is the Canada Emergency Rent Subsidy. So similar to the CEWS, this is relief for businesses who experienced a decrease in revenue due to the pandemic. There are calculations involved to say how much did my revenue decrease by, but the calculations are the same as those for the CEWS. More information is available online, of course. Here's the web link. And what's important to note is that whether you rent your church property or you own your church property, you can still qualify for the subsidy in either situation. So for example, if you rent your qualifying property, here's a list of what the eligible expenses are. Rent, of course, things like property taxes, the gas bill, the hydro bill. If you own the qualifying property, here's a list of the eligible expenses. You can see it's a bit more limited, but it does include things like property taxes and property insurance. The area of government support we'll look at today is capital projects. So a capital project, perhaps installing an elevator or a ramp or a lift, might be necessary for your church to comply with the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. And the federal government does have funding available for mobility needs. So speaking from my own church's experience, we're building an elevator lift at the moment, and we received a grant from the government for $91,000 towards this lift. So if your church is looking to improve its accessibility, building a ramp or an elevator, something like that, I encourage you to check out the Enabling Accessibility Fund, and the website is on this page. Other sources of funding for capital projects, the Ontario Trillium Foundation is one. I also encourage you to check out local charitable foundations. They might have grants available. One in Toronto is the Catherine Donnelly Foundation. Okay, on to question 4. Questions 4 and 5 are the shortest questions. Question 4, what accounting system does CBOQ or other member churches use? At CBOQ, we use Sage 300. I've spoken with our treasurers. Other systems used by our local churches are Sage 50, Power Church, QuickBooks, Excel. So again, question for you, are you happy with your accounting software? Would you recommend it to other churches? If the answer is yes, please write a message in the Zoom chat. Maybe say what software you're using, what do you like about it, what's the cost? We're a family of churches, so if the system is good for you, it might be good for another member of our church family. And that brings us to our 5th and final question. When is the deadline to file my church's T3010 return? The T3010 is the Registered Charity Information Return. It's an annual filing. It must be submitted to CRA within 6 months of your fiscal year end. It's important to note that last year there was a deadline extension offered, but that extension is not available in 2021. So your T3010 is due 6 months after your fiscal year end. So that brings us to the end of our church finance FAQs. Thank you so much for your time.
Welcome to the HR Frequently Asked Questions portion of this learning session. My name is Koon Wah Leung, Senior Director of Operations at CBOQ, with responsibility for finance, HR, communications, and membership. I've asked Mark Potvin, our Acting Director for Church Life and Leadership, to join me as he has walked with many of our church boards and our pastors on our HR questions. Mark, thank you so much for agreeing to share your wisdom and your experience with us today.
Well, thank you, Koon, for having invited me. It's really a privilege to help member churches to move towards healthy work environment.
Wonderful. And Mark, one of the most common questions that comes from both boards and pastors are ones that you've heard before. From our boards, how do we deal with a pastor who is not listening to the board? And from our pastors, how can I help my board better understand my vision and hear my direction? So Mark, how do you approach and guide these conversations? Yes,
these are common questions that I receive. First, it's very important for the communication process to be clear in my mind when I'm listening to one side or the other or both sides, and to seek clarity to determine the issues. I'm saying this because quite often the main issue has to do with expectations. Does one side or the other have expectations that haven't been expressed or haven't been understood? Do both parties know the expectations? That's why it's important to understand both perspectives. Sometimes issues arise also related to the Constitution, to bylaw or policy matters. Sometimes those policies sit in the corner somewhere collecting dust, but somebody remembers them and starts bringing them up while the other party is totally unaware of what's in them. So it's important to consult those documents together if we're going to talk about the same thing. Now, I want to let your listeners also know that CBOQ has great resources available to help boards and to help pastors and other staff navigate the world of employee and employer world. You know, churches don't often think of themselves as being employers, but they are. And pastors don't often think of themselves and other staff as employees, but in a true sense of the way they are. So if there's an understanding that what's the role of an employee and what's the role of an employer, that helps in navigating sometimes some rough waters. Now, I'm not saying that we need to take the spiritual aspect of church leadership away, but it's important to remember that ultimately the church is an employer. So it's important to have good HR not purposes, but practices. And for that purpose, CBOQ designed a workbook or a material that is called Building Sound HR Practices for Churches. Building Sound HR Practices for Churches. Now, if the conflict becomes quite profound, then it becomes important to discern whether the conflict will continue to escalate and if there's further help that is needed.
Thank you, Mark. I see two key takeaways from your experiences that you've shared. One, the CBOQ Church Life and Leadership Team and HR resources are available to member churches if help is needed. And secondly, if best practices are implemented, some of these communication issues could be prevented. And to that end, I'd like to highlight a few important aspects from our Building Sound HR Practices resource for our churches. And within our website at baptist.ca, this resource is available. And one of the areas that it highlights is it's important to have a personnel team or coordinator to support church HR processes and accountability to the board. This helps to clarify staff responsibilities and role descriptions and set those expectations. And also, it's important to establish annual work plans and action plans and professional development plans, along with annual reviews with church staff. Annually, it's also important to review staff salaries, allowances, benefits, working conditions, and so forth in order to make recommendations to the board for budget planning. Remember to consult with search committees on recruitment, interview, and the hiring process, and also to understand the requirements for confidentiality, accessibility, and the employment standards that are within your province. Mark, from a pastor's perspective, why is it important to have clear role descriptions, action plans, and annual reviews with the personnel team or the governance board?
Good question, Koon. Thanks for asking that. In part, it has to do with boundaries, because boundaries are important, and that's what the clear role description will tackle. But I must say that many churches are uncomfortable about those setting of those boundaries, or even creating clear role descriptions and work plans and annual evaluations for and with their pastor. But they're so important because the description, the work plan, and those evaluation enhance good communication between the board and the staff, especially the senior pastor. Having things communicated well and written down makes things much simpler and easier in the long run. Yes, they require more work in the front end, but in the end, that work will pay off. And a good employment description also helps in evaluating the ministry that is being done in the church and by the pastor and also by volunteers. Now, I know that not everyone likes evaluation because they do sound like, well, rather business-like and not spiritual enough, but it is a spiritual exercise. They're not meant to be, they're not meant to be sticks to be used by boards on their pastors, but they are conversation tools. It also allows the pastor to have a dialogue with the board, especially if they're asked to do a self-evaluation. Now, what evaluation does in the end is that it puts everyone on the same pages, and it also sets out again some expectations and talks about expectations, which, as we saw earlier, can be a source of disagreement between board and pastor.
Yes, Mark, I think the annual, ministry, whether it's a work or action plan, and that review process is a great way to ensure that the vision and mission of the church are discussed proactively with pastors and church staff, and that there is alignment on duties and responsibilities for the ministry year. Another frequently asked questions that we get is, how do we know what to pay our pastor? Mark, I'm going to throw that one back at you.
Sure. Money, we all love talking about money, right? Especially when somebody else's, I suppose. But actually, CBOQ provides a salary guide for pastoral leaders, which can be found on the resource tab under the church operations and personnel tab. The guide adjusts for experience, location, and numbers of staff that report to the pastor, so it's incremental that way. But let me be clear is that these are only guidelines. CBOQ does not expect a church to pay a salary that is beyond what that church can pay. The guidelines are created for all churches, all 340 somewhat churches, but your church may be in a specific area that perhaps is depressed, or the salaries are much lower than everywhere else. So church boards must use their wisdom and their discretion in figuring out, okay, what should we pay exactly our salary for salary. But at the same time, the church has to remember that a pastor has to live and has to provide for his or her family. So there's usually always some tension between what the church can pay and what the pastor would like to receive or should be receiving. Don't be afraid to have a good, solid conversation with your pastor concerning that, at least once a year, to make sure that you're on the same page. Because sometimes it's not so much how much money will I get in my pocket, but it's knowing how much my church cares. And if I know that the church can't afford paying me what I'm worth, perhaps, at least I know that they care and they're working hard at it. And maybe there's other ways that you can help with the compensation in different ways, such as maybe an extra few days of vacation. I also want to highlight an important policy consideration for your church, for your pastor. And that consideration is around sick leave. We don't often think about sick leave until we really need it. And if it's not there, then it's an extra cause of stress. Now, we know that the pandemic has taken a toll on all people, and especially on our pastors, because they've had to take on extra demands. And it could be that some of our pastors are in need of extra rest. This is where the sick leave can come in. Now, within the salary guide, you will notice that CBOQ recommends that churches put a policy in place. And let me read to you what our recommendation is to our churches. When it comes to sick leave, we ask that an employee, a pastor, shall receive credit for 15 days paid sick leave per year. So 15 days per year of sick leave. Unused sick leave can be accumulated, or credit should be allowed to accumulate from year to year to a maximum of 85 days. And if there's accumulated sick leave at the end of the pastor's ministry, then that sick leave is forfeited. Therefore, it's gone. He does not take, or she does not take that with her. Finally, let me just put in a word also for you as boards to encourage your pastors and their family to use the Employee and Family Assistance Program. That is there for them. you already are paying that as part of the remittance you give to CBOQ. So that means that this service of the employment assistance program is available to the family members and to the pastors free of charge. It's a confidential service. The website has much information, but you can also talk to a live person, 24 hours, 7. It's a great service. Also encourage your pastors to remember that as part of their medical benefit, they do have counseling through a registered psychotherapist or a psychologist or social worker. They do have access to that, not just for themselves, but also for their family members. Can you, I'm sure there are other resources that I've forgotten there for our pastors. Can you, Koon, maybe fill in where I've left some holes?
Mark, thanks for bringing up this important question about, when someone needs some days to take care of themselves and potentially for sickness or disability leave. I'll address it with some preventative measures and then also what to do if it gets more serious. So with wellness and prevention, make sure that check in with your pastors and your staff to provide prayer and board support and to discuss work-life balance. We know that it's been a tough year with the pandemic and that many of our pastors are overstretched and quite burdened. Also encourage pastors and staff to take vacation days and to plan for times of rest so they can spend time with family, and eventually with friends when the pandemic is over. Also, review resources that are available through the benefits program, such as psychologists, therapists, and the employee and family assistance program. And don't forget to support your pastors as they seek to join CBOQ Soul Days, Tuesdays, Pastors Prayer Time, and spiritual retreats that are offered. Now, if sick days have been used up, from the church policy, or if the church does not have this policy, the pastor or staff may be able to access the unemployment insurance sickness leave, which is for 15 weeks. And then, if needed, transition to long-term disability if the disability criteria is met. Under the EI sickness leave program, the church should issue a record of employment using the reason code D for illness or injury on the last day that the employee is at work. They can then take this record of employment to Service Canada to apply for EI sickness benefits. And there is a 2-week waiting period, but then payment can start and is capped at 55% of weekly salary for 15 weeks at a maximum of $595 per week. And that's in 2021 values. If a church wishes to top up the EI income during this leave, they can register a supplemental unemployment benefit plan with Service Canada. And then this will allow the church to top up to 95% salary without penalty to the employee, so they can continue receiving EI during this time. Now, if an employee does anticipate that they'll be unable to return to work when the EI sickness benefits run out after the 15 weeks, they should begin applying for long-term disability benefits as early as possible. If the LTD criteria is met, the employee will continue to receive LTD benefits until they recover or are able to return to work or reach age 65. And Mark, getting back to the question about salaries, CBOQ has survey results from 140 of our member churches that provide us with information on salary ranges within our family. We can look at aggregated data amongst urban versus rural churches, solo and multiple pastor churches, and even some information on non-pastoral roles. So please reach out to our HR resources if you need help with the salary tool, employment contract templates, tax reporting requirements, and specific HR questions. The CLL, or Church Life and Leadership, and HR teams have provided guidance to churches that have asked about conflict management, the impact of budget cuts due to COVID, and also creating healthy church transition plans.
Conflict management is an area that we do receive quite a few calls, as you can imagine. Maybe your church has called us. because sadly pastors and churches are human beings, and we human beings tend to enter into conflicts. And sometimes those conflicts are difficult to manage, and emotions get involved and so on, and they increase, they get embroiled. Your church gets embroiled in a conflict. Like most times we seek to go there as compassionate and objective mediators. The CLL team is only capable of doing so much just because of our resources, time, resource, and capability. So when that happens, we will suggest to you professional mediators or professional conflict management organization that will help you figure these things out. That's their bread and butter, and they are really well trained in that area. So Koon, what can a church, what can pastors do when conflicts seem to rise in temperature, let's say, before it gets to the red zone, but just, just at that level when it says, ooh, this starts to feel warm here. What can they do?
Yes, unfortunately, Mark, conflict can arise even in the most Christ-centered of work environments. So in these cases, having a specific policy to address conflict issues fairly quickly is highly advantageous to restoring positive working relations. So our HR guide for the churches actually have steps that are outlined, and these are fairly simple steps, but not necessarily easy to follow. So I'm just going to review steps 1 to 3 and then just share a little bit more perspective. So step 1 within the process and the policy is that whenever possible, the employee should seek to resolve interpersonal problems or concerns with one another directly. And the nature of the grievance should be stated clearly and understood by both parties. In step 2, where step 1 fails or is not appropriate, one or both parties should seek the counsel of the personnel team without delay. And the personnel team will meet with both parties that are concerned to try to resolve the grievance and note the dates, circumstances, and any agreements in a documented form. And the parties involved in the mediation will retain copies of this memorandum. And step 3, should the initial steps be inadequate, the persons with the grievance should, with undue delay, present this case to the church board. Each party in the procedure may request the presence of an observer, and then the board determines what course of action is appropriate and takes responsibility for seeing that the recommended action is implemented. And again, these are processes, but Mark, you mentioned, we're working with people here. So what I would counsel is that even within these processes, we have to remember to seek to understand and really listen to the other side, and to also have grace as we share our side too. And I think, sometimes it's important not to blame or point fingers or to jump to conclusions about someone's intent. So giving people the benefit of the doubt and the opportunity to explain. And frequently when we give feedback, we can phrase it in a way where it's not accusatory, and maybe it's more, I'm going to use an example, Mark, I think is the best way to illustrate it. Mark, it really makes me feel defensive when you don't seek to hear my side of the story. So again, putting it to how something makes one feel versus saying you did this and you caused this might just help the communication aspect and keep people's walls and defense down. So those are some of the common ways to communicate. And again, some advice that was given to me a long time ago is that feedback is a gift and should be received as so, even though sometimes it's hard to hear, and sometimes we might not even agree with it, but that person has spent time and likely has prayed about providing this feedback. And it's, as long as it's done so with care and with love, we should try to receive it, to listen, and then we can pray and discern if it's something that we need to address. Hopefully, Mark, that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you, Koon. Very wise words and good advice as well, especially when it comes to our emotions. If our emotions come well up, then we need to acknowledge those, and that the others in the room too can hear that we acknowledge our emotions, and that helps to bring the temperature down for sure. But what if I may, Koon, I'd like to switch topics for now. I understand that your church, which is Spring Garden Baptist Church in Toronto, it just went through a search committee that you were searching for a new member on your pastoral staff, and you went through this process. Can you share how that worked and how CBOQ, how the staff got involved?
Sure. I wasn't personally on the search committee because I didn't want to exert undue influence. So I really trusted the wisdom of the search team and know that CBOQ did come up quite a few times. My husband was on the committee, so I got to see the process from afar. And where CBOQ helped was the church life and leadership team was able to provide good recommendations on candidates based on the position and the experience that was required. The search team, while they met, also looked at the resources that were available online for search committees, and they reviewed considerations for skill sets that were outlined, as well as potential interview questions. And I heard personally from Pastor Greg that having the post up on the CBOQ website also helped them to attract really great candidates and submissions as well. So I know that each of our church does things a little bit differently, but it was really good to have access to staff recommendations and also to have guidelines so that nothing is missed in the consideration. So at the end of the day, the search team really took the time to work through and understand the job description, because that was new, to evaluate the candidates for their skills as well as their fit, and then spent quite some time discerning together to hear God's affirmation. And God guided their path throughout, and now we have a wonderful new addition to our pastoral team.
Great. I'm really glad to hear that the search team at your church did spend the time it needed to do the work at the front end, especially when it came to the position description, because that is really key to go looking for the person that will fit exactly the position that you need. Sometimes churches don't do this, and then they flounder looking for a pastor because they haven't spent the time to think about what is it exactly that they need for their next pastor. That front end work for searching for a pastor is so important. Now, Koon, sometimes I've heard search committee ask, when should we talk to the candidates, to our pastoral candidates? When should we talk to them about money? Like right at the beginning, at the end, never talk about it, or what?
So this one is, again, every church may do things a little bit differently, but typically once a candidate is chosen and references are checked and the offer is drafted, this is likely where money and benefits are outlined. And this should be presented to the candidate well. Now, it's important to not only present the salary, but the total compensation package, including benefits, which typically net out at about $4,000 to $5,000 a year, and also the church's pension match for the pastor at the 6%. We also recommend 4 weeks of vacation for pastors, and again, up to 15 sick days, as you mentioned earlier. And some churches also may offer housing support as well. So that's where I would recommend that most churches would bring up money. And again, talking about total compensation and not just focus only on the salary part.
Yeah, I so agree with you, Koon, that churches need to not only talk about the salary, like the pay part of things, but also the benefits attached to the whole package. And after all, CBM has a fantastic pension, so why not promote it? Saying, hey, you're getting the Cadillac of pensions, really. I could talk more about that, but I know we don't have time right now.
So Mark, thank you so much for sharing your insights and your wisdom with us. And do you have any final words of advice and encouragement for our audience today?
Yeah, I guess my parting words would be to don't forget, if you have a question, don't forget to go look on our website, CBOQ, oh, sorry, wrong website, baptist.ca. There's all kinds of information there and all kinds of documents. If you're not exactly sure what you're looking for, if you're looking for something that has to do with treasurer, just go in the search button and type up treasurer in there. It will come up. If you're looking for credentials, accreditation for your pastor, just put accreditation and the documents will come up. At least one of them will, and it will help you to find the others. It's a great resource that is there. And finally, don't just stay on the website, call us. We're there to serve you. All of us on the Church Life and Leadership team are there to serve you, as is the next generation, as is the member care and communication and the finance department. Our bread and butter is you, so use us.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. And on that note, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today in the session with finance and HR questions. Now that the formal education part is over, we're going to move into a time of Q&A. So please use your chat functions and we'll do our best to answer your questions. Thanks so much, Mark.
You're welcome.
Great. So I did note down some questions that came up during our session, Adam. So the first one is a question about Robertson Hall and ecclesiastical insurance and whether they raised rates this year. Someone reported, maybe even a 30% rate increase.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Yes, I saw part of the question was any recommendations for other insurance providers in Quebec. So during the presentation, I was just trying to find a list we have of some insurance providers in Quebec. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find it yet. So what I'll have to do is find the list of insurance providers that we know of in Quebec, and I'll send it on by email. I believe the question came from D. Yip. So is anyone else located in Quebec who would like to receive that information as well?
Adam, maybe I can just step in. I was able to email our administrator on the finance team because I know she's dealt with this question before, and she quickly did write back that both, I think, Deeks and Ecclesiastical do have provide insurance to Quebec, but that, yeah, Robertson Hall, unfortunately, does not offer that service or even through any broker, I think. So I hope you're okay with that, Adam.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And I do know that like even my own personal insurance, right? Like I've received increases in both the house part as well as the auto part this year, even though I've stayed at home the most times. So, okay. And another question for you is whether you would be able to share slides with our attendees, Adam.
Yeah, absolutely. So first comment, this whole video will be available to you online in case you want to rewatch part of it or the whole thing or share it with others. If anyone would like a copy of the slide deck for the finance FAQs, I'd be happy to share it with you. So Koon, would a good thing to do, could I just send it to everyone in attendance today?
I think that would be fine. We'll just, make sure that we have everyone's email address from Carol, and you can share your slides. There was one slide, slide 28 from your presentation. One of the participants was wondering if you could show that again.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know on my presentation, there was a lot of, oh, go to this website, this other website. So we'll make sure to distribute the slides because there was a lot of web links shared. So I'm going to share my screen now to go to slide 28 as requested.
Okay, and maybe while we have that slide up, Adam, there was a CEWS question that came in as to whether CEWS, if that applies to service contract, I guess, people versus an employee of the church.
That's a great question. My church had a similar scenario where we have employees, but also we have independent contractors. Unfortunately for the CEWS program, the subsidy is only available for employees. So service contractors or independent contractors would not, the cost paid to them would not be covered under the subsidy.
Okay, and a second CEWS question is whether the December CEWS deadline is in July, knowing that, you know, the November one is coming up in, you know, a couple of days, people might not have time to get to it, but is the December deadline in July?
Yeah, that's a great question. It is a bit tight for sure to meet the June 17 deadline for the November period, but yeah, you're absolutely right. The deadline to apply for the December period, a few weeks in December, is in July. So the deadlines to submit the CEWS applications are 120 days after the end of the application period. So that particular period, yes, I believe the deadline is July 15. So then the following period would be due in August, and then after that, September. So yeah, great question. So that period will be due in July, that's correct.
Okay. And we got one more question that came in while the video was playing. And this one is there a way to help pastors understand the clergy residence tax benefit reduction? And that this could help to bridge kind of, I guess, you know, the perceived gap between what a layperson would need to make as their gross income, because you know, lay people would not have access to this benefit. So Adam, I was wondering if we could maybe tag team this one. Do you want to give some perspective on how much the clergy residence tax deduction might be worth? And if you want, we can, you know, take the slide down and just, and that way, if people are unmuting and have further questions, then we can see them.
Great, absolutely. So with the clergy residence deduction, there's a bit of a formula involved with it, but typically it'll work out to 1/3 of the pastoral salary will be taken as a deduction when they file their income tax return. So what that means is 1/3, typically 1/3 of their income is not subject to CPP or income taxes. So there is a form to be completed for it. I believe it's T1223. So I encourage you to look into that form because the pastor does need to complete it annually. It's an annual form that has to be completed. Not necessarily submitted to the Canada Revenue Agency. You just have to have it in your back pocket in case the CRA asks to see it. So that's a bit of background information. And Koon, maybe before I pass it to you, other comment I have is we're working on some communication to provide more guidance on the clergy residence deduction. And I believe that will be distributed soon. A bit of guidance in terms of where to find the form and how the calculations work.
Okay. Great. So thanks for that clarification. And I think, you know, in my experience, the deduction works out to maybe a net of a few $1,000s that the pastor then wouldn't have to pay or could get back if they're not filling in all that paperwork up front. So again, I think this talks about the overall compensation package and not just the salary part, which is only, you know, a big part of it, but not the only part. So, you know, salary plus, you know, benefits that cost about $4,000 or $5,000 a year, that's 6% pension match, and the clergy residence deduction, which again could be, I think, anywhere between, you know, $3,000-4,000 a year, can add up in terms of overall compensation. So it is important to help them to see the comprehensive nature of total compensation. There was another question that did come in on whether housing allowance, do you have to pay CPP on this amount?
Oh, that's a good question. You know, I'd have to do a bit of research in there to be sure I give you the correct answer. So what I can do is I can take note of that question and get back to you on it. I just want to ensure the answer I give is totally accurate.
Okay.
Can I say something for a second?
Of course.
Okay, it's Marjorie McAllister from First Baptist Church. I just was speaking to the government, and they told me that I should be charging CPP on his housing allowance, and they have charged us back.
Okay.
So I never knew that before. So that's why I was asking the question.
Okay, so the CRA said you're required to withhold and remit CPP on the housing allowance?
Yes, yes.
And that's great information. Thank you for sharing that, because when we find out information like this, you know, sometimes we will include it in the out of operations so that all our treasurers can benefit from that information. So we'll just make sure, you know, we kind of read and check through everything to confirm, and then we can then share this information more broadly so that, yeah, so that we're protecting our churches.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, okay. And then another question came in: can a full-time pastoral staff at a church get that deduction if they don't have the designation of reverend? So this is pastoral staff full-time without a reverend designation.
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. I believe the answer is yes. There is a guideline. It's a fairly lengthy PDF of guidance on the clergy residence deduction from the CRA. It runs through particular duties the employee has to do and their responsibilities in order to qualify for it, for the clergy residence deduction. I believe the answer is yes, but you have to just go through the criteria outlined. And I can send you the PDF if you wish.
Okay, great. And that is my understanding too, Adam, that it's not only available to people who are ordained or deemed reverend by the church, but that pastoral staff could qualify. And I think, you know, sometimes the question comes up on whether kind of youth, maybe workers or, you know, youth directors versus a youth pastor. Those, I think you will need to clearly read through the CRA guidance and the criteria to make that determination for the church. And, you know, if you do have any questions to specific cases, again, Adam, myself, we're available to consult. And also we can even, you know, bring in the CLL team and see what other churches also have been doing too. But again, for a pastoral role that is defined as a pastor, I believe that it's clear that the clergy residence tax should be, clergy residence deduction should be applicable. Okay, and thank you, John, for posting that. I think the information about the allowances. Okay. Okay, and please feel free to unmute and to ask your questions just straight out without having to type them in.
If I may, we have Guide to Pastor Payroll comes out of CBOQ, and there's a box regarding withholding deductions, and it tells you which parts of the salary, the residence and the group life insurance is subject to CPP, what is subject to EI, what is subject to tax, and how they make up the pension part. It comes right from you people. For ages, we've gone by that. The basic salary and group life insurance, CPP, EI is determined on basic salary plus the clergy residence. Tax determined on basic salary and the group life insurance, and pension on the basic salary and clergy residence.
Thank you for that. I'm gonna, if Adam, if you can listen out for further questions, I'm gonna maybe direct people to where they can find that online.
Sounds great. Hey, do we have any other finance or HR questions anyone else would like to raise? Or comments, knowledge sharing, if you have anything you want to share with the group, that's certainly welcome too.
Adam, I just have a comment. We had done a review of, at salary time, the CBOQ salary guideline, and looked at something as equivalent as we could find, which was the CCC, like the quadruple C salary survey. And it looked like things were kind of out of alignment. The CBOQ salary guideline was quite a bit higher, especially for youth pastors, which was kind of our area of interest. So there may be some changes coming or a review of the CBOQ guidelines. I wonder if you could comment on that.
Sure, thank you. Koon, would you like to respond to that one? Sure, I'll take that one. Yes, every year we do a review of the salary guideline for the next year. So this year we were able to access a survey of over 140 of our own churches, and we'll be doing some benchmarking against what is actually in field and in real life situations. Now where we have solo pastor and multiple pastor churches, some of those roles we have more data on. For youth pastors, I know that I think the Fellowship Baptist actually did a survey across Canada for the salary for youth pastors, and they did produce a document. So let me know if that's something that that would be beneficial to this group as well, because I know that we don't always have full data on all the different types of pastoral roles within our churches.
Yeah, okay, thank you. That would be interesting for sure.
Okay. So maybe Adam, when we talk about sending things out, we can kind of aggregate things together and send it out all in one.
Yep, that's a great idea.
And I was just looking at our website, baptist.ca, and if you go into the tab of resources, church operations and finance, I think there's a lot of great documents on there, and this is probably where some of the guidance on what is taxable and what is not, and what should be included in terms of calculations for pension, etc. Okay. So maybe we'll just wait a couple more minutes for questions, and if not, then we can release people, but I want to give people a chance to ask their questions.
Yeah, just follow-up question on the salary guidelines. Because we're a church in Montreal, Quebec, and what we find with the guidelines that the CBOQ publishes is it seems to be more Ontario-centric. So when you're revising your guidelines, are you going to take into consideration salaries in Quebec, or would you create a separate guideline for, let's say, the province of Quebec?
So I'm going to have to go back and look at the data that we have collected from all our churches, because we're only so good as kind of the data that the churches share back with us, and see if there are, you know, churches that can properly represent Montreal and Quebec. And we just have to make sure we have a large enough sample size that we could actually use that data and share that, because we only share aggregated data. We don't share, you know, anything that's identifiable. So I think we can certainly do that. Now, it might, I don't know that this type of information will always make it into that guide with the calculations. So if there are specific questions, I would advise you, you know, reach out to, you know, to HR, to myself or Yvette on our team, or to, you know, someone like Mark as part of the church life and leadership team. And we can give you a little bit more specific information to your region, to whether, you know, some, you know, your church is in a city, urban center, or if it's in a rural center, because there are differences there too.
Right. Sounds good. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so if there are no more questions, I just wanted to thank you again for joining us today with our session. And Adam, thank you so much for all the work that you've done and all the wisdom you've shared, as well as giving people your information so they can contact you with any queries. This session and other sessions, other learning sessions, the 19 that we have from Assembly 2021 will be made available to all of you after the conference. An email with those details will be sent to you. Just give us about a week or so to post everything online, to set up the passwords. And after you receive your passwords, you'll be able to view all 19 of those sessions. And we're just so grateful for your continued efforts to serve your church and your community in the name of Jesus, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you so much to everyone. Have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye.